Hello. So today I'm going to be looking at and discussing Charlemagne's empire and why it was important to the broader sense of Europe, and even though it really didn't last that long. Because Charlemagne's empire lasted from roughly 814 AD to when he died, to 840 AD when his son died, and the entire empire was split in three between his grandchildren, and when they died it was split even further. So it really did not last that long, lasting only about 26 years, yet it had a very profound impact on European society, even up until the 1800s. So the state of Europe prior to Charlemagne's empire was rather tumultuous, really. So the Western Roman Empire fell around the year 476 AD, when Germanic barbarians and invaders invaded the regions of Italy, Gaul, Spain, and northern Africa, and set up their own kingdoms. And there were a few things that really defined or made these Germans different from the Romans that they had conquered. The Romans had a sort of proto-nationalistic sense about them. We usually think of nationalism as a more modern thing. It's like 1800s, 1900s was nationalism with the creation of countries, but Rome was very nationalistic, and being Roman was more than just being an individual citizen. Being Roman meant that you upheld the idea of what Rome stood for and what Rome was, sort of as people do today, as they believe they are Americans or Germans and stuff like that. They uphold the idea of the state. When the Germans invaded, that wasn't a thing. The German kingdoms strictly had a loyalty basis. So the lord, or the people below the chief, were loyal to the chief. And that was it. They weren't loyal to the chief's kingdom, the chief's tribe, the chief's anything. They were loyal to the chief. And this is how the feudalism system sort of was set up and started. Along with that, the Germans also didn't have large standing armies, as they didn't really have the funds to pay for it as the Romans did. So you would have soldiers who spent most of their time being regular people and would only become soldiers when called upon by their chief, or king, as they are now being called. And this kind of made the currency system obsolete, and the regions, the new Germanic kingdoms now began to rely heavily on agriculture and trading, whereas the Romans did have a rather good currency system. So next we're going to be looking at the Frankish kingdom specifically. So the Frankish kingdom wasn't started by Charlemagne's family or Charlemagne's dynasty. It was actually started by the Merovingian dynasty with the conquests of a man named Clovis. Now the Merovingians, after Clovis, had a long series of weak and short-lived kings, as there was much infighting between the brothers and relatives of the Merovingians. And up to the 700s, when the Carolingians started to gain power, the Merovingian king was like nothing more than a weak-willed figurehead who couldn't really control the lords of his realm. But there was no way to topple this king. Frankish laws didn't really give a way to get rid of a weak-willed king. So they needed to figure out a way to get over this, and I'll explain this how Charlemagne's father, Pepin, was able to somehow get over this problem. So next we're going to be looking at how Charlemagne's empire sort of stabilized Europe. So it established a Europe that was much more closer and connected than it was previously. Before, the kingdoms and the lords and everyone within it was a rather decentralized thing. So there may have been a lot of people living within the Frankish kingdom, a lot of lords, but they didn't really have much loyalty to the king of the Frankish kingdom. When Charlemagne came around, he kind of changed that, and he allowed these new kingdoms, these new proxy kingdoms, to have a much more centralized state. And as you can see, he sort of set what would become the new kingdoms of Europe. It would become the modern countries of Europe, as he had when the empire is broken in three between his grandchildren, with France in the west, Germany in the east, and then what would become Italy, which was part of Middle Francia. Along with that, Charlemagne also helped reestablish the currency system that had disappeared when the Roman Empire had fell. One of the biggest things that Charlemagne had done was establishing the relationship between the church and the royalty of Europe. So as I said previously, as there was no way to topple the king of the Frankish kingdoms, Charlemagne's father, Pepin, decided to get the Pope to help him, as the Pope needed help against his enemies, and Pepin needed help to become the king of the Franks. So the Pope said that if Pepin helped him and protected him, then the Pope would make Pepin the king of the Franks. Now, this did set the precedent that the Pope had the power to do this, but it really became much more powerful when Charlemagne was crowned emperor, as this placed the Pope higher than every other secular kingdom within Europe. And it also unofficially split the Western and Eastern Christian churches, that being what would later be known as Catholicism and what would later be known as Eastern Orthodoxy. Charlemagne also set the precedent for what you would do with your wealth as a lord, as he donated heavily to the church and to monasteries, and he felt this was the duty as someone with a lot of money that they had to do. And we would see through medieval times that lords and kings, it was their duty to donate money to the church, and when they died, they had to leave a large sum of money to the church. And this was all because that's what Charlemagne did, so that's what everyone else had to do. And finally, Charlemagne also put an emphasis on forceful conversions, as he was well known to really be brutal in his tactics for converting the Germanic tribes who still did not believe in Christ. And this set the idea that you could sort of just go somewhere and force someone to be a Christian, as later organizations and institutions such as the Teutonic Order would do when they were trying to Christianize the Baltic states, such as Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia and such. And finally, Charlemagne started what would be known as the Carolingian Renaissance. So, against popular belief, the Dark Ages really didn't encompass all of the medieval times. There were certain periods when there were sort of dark periods, but the entire medieval times was there was actually a lot of cultural and scientific growth. And a lot of this could be attributed to Charlemagne, as he had the idea of collecting minds from everywhere in Europe and allowing them to sort of think and create ideas, because he's put a great emphasis on learning and culture and language, especially language. Charlemagne had a very big focus on preserving and transcribing old Roman documents. So much so, in the way that they did it, their script and their handwriting was so good that when Renaissance thinkers, like 15th century Renaissance and humanist thinkers, were looking through trying to find old Roman documents, they stumbled upon Charlemagne's old manuscripts, and because the writing was so good and so amazing, they just assumed it was old classical Roman scripts, when in actuality it was like early medieval Gothic scripts. And it kind of set the idea that like their handwriting was in a much more simpler and easier way to read, and it was so beautiful that it just took these Renaissance thinkers by surprise. So finally, what did Charlemagne's empire do? Well, it sort of stabilized Europe and set borders for modern day countries. It established the positions of the nobility and clergy in society, and it put the Pope ahead of sort of secular society. And this wouldn't be overturned until Napoleon, when Napoleon took the crown from the Pope, who was going to place on his head, and crowned Napoleon King of the French, or Emperor of France. And Napoleon didn't let the Pope do that. Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of France, which sort of symbolizes the end of the Pope having sort of this power over the secular kings and monarchs of Europe. And finally, Charlemagne instituted what would be sort of a proto-Renaissance in the Carolingian Renaissance that would continue on for a lot of the medieval times. And I hope that sort of cleared up a few things about what Charlemagne's empire did and why it was important. Thanks.